So I have a couple of polls relative to this. I just want to kind of get an idea of the group that we have online here. So my first poll is just to find out who has attended Lunch and Learns in the past. If you could just vote for me here. I just want to kind of see if everyone is aware or not aware of what we do with these sessions. Okay, let me just go ahead and close that and share that. So we do have some folks that have not attended these before. Just to make sure it's clear, I like to do this at the beginning. This is a kind of an informal presentation, a discussion of configurations. More, I call them a training session in a sense that, you know, we're digging in further in these areas to see what's good, what's bad, what you can use now, how it might fit. So these Lunch and Learn sessions have various topics, and you know, if you have a topic that you want covered in a future Lunch and Learn, again, feel free to post that in the questions section. Actually, this topic came from an existing customer as well, who wanted to get more acquainted with configuration, so I obliged and set this up for us going forward. Another question here. I want to find out who is using configurations currently. Do you on a daily basis go in there, create configurations, and use them in assemblies and in drawings? And I'm kind of expecting quite a cross section here. All right, let me show you what we have here. So this is a good sign. Some of you are using it, some of you are not using it. My hope today is to make you more comfortable in making a decision whether or not you should or shouldn't use configuration. It doesn't fit in every situation, but I want to kind of give you an idea of where those limitations are and when you should and shouldn't use it. For those of you who are using configurations, I listed a few tools here. If you could just give me an idea of what tools you're using to create configurations. So we have, in all these things, well, most of these things we're going to cover today. I got looking at the topic of configurations, and you know, as you start to break down and understand all the different areas that it affects in the software, I kind of had to break down my topic into a subset of the information just so that we can cover it in the hour session here today. Let me go ahead and close this and just show you what we're looking at here today. So, you know, most of you are doing manual configurations. The good thing is today we're going to cover a majority of what we're going to cover today is the manual side, an understanding of what you can and can't do, what the interface is telling you, where to go to do certain things. But we are going to cover two of the other topics on that list. The modified configurations dialog. I feel like this one was kind of slid in there over the last several years, and never was there a real true understanding of where it fits. Well, I'm hoping to clear that up today to give you an understanding of how you might use the modify configurations dialog. Design tables, I'm going to keep that out of today's topic. I'm going to have just one snippet of design tables, simply because that can take this from a 1-hour session to a 10-hour session with all the capabilities. But really the base for design tables comes from our conversation today. And once you have this part of it down and you're comfortable with what you can and can't do, then you can take it to the next step with design tables. And I think it's quite interesting that nobody online is using the configuration publisher, and it's probably because it wasn't very well publicized. But I want to show you some examples of where the configuration publisher might come into play here. So our topic today, titled Nuts and Bolts of Configurations, what we're going to cover is kind of these 6 areas I want to discuss. First of all, just giving folks an understanding as to what is a configuration. You know, what does it mean in the terms of the software? I came up with a couple of reasons why you should use them, and some situations when you should not use them. We're going to go through manual configuration creation. I'm going to take you through the interface. I'm going to take you through what can be configured in parts, what can be configured in assemblies, and look at the different areas we go to make those things happen. And then we're going to cover the modify configuration dialog, which is something that most people have not run into, and then a brief snippet at the end of the configuration publisher. So starting out, what are configurations? In general, and I even went to the help to try to describe this, it's variations of a part or assembly within a single document. So any time that you have a variation of that design and you don't want to manage multiple parts or files within your file system and manage revision control on each of those different files, then configurations is a good use. Families of parts with different parameters. When we say parameters, that's really what our discussion is today, is what are these things that can be different in configurations, and how and why would I use those different things. Well, when should you use them? And I kind of just discussed this. When you want to control those variations in a single file. I always come back to the idea of an O-ring. If I have 300 possible sizes and diameters of an O-ring, would I really want to create a separate file for each of those and manage those across the board in multiple assemblies? It's not something you would want to do. So that's a case where you would definitely want to use configurations. But here's one thing to think about when using or wanting to use configurations. There's not an easy way to set a revision for individual configurations. When I say not an easy way, I'll talk about a way that you could possibly do it, but it's not very clean and it's kind of hidden from everyone else. So I typically say when you create a file that have multiple variations, I would only do this if the file gets revised together. In other words, when you make a change to it, the entire document, regardless of how many variations, would go from revision A to revision B. It's just too hard to manage each of those individually. So that's one thing to think about. When should you not use them? As I mentioned, the revision thing, that's a perfect scenario where you would not want to use configurations. And the other one is for display variations. And I've seen this through the years where folks will create configurations to do things like changing color, hiding or showing components. That's really not what it's for. There's display states in SolidWorks, and display states are used for display variations. It's kind of configurations for how your models look, hidden line visible, hidden remove, the color, the transparency, the hide or show. You never want to get into using configurations for display. There is a way to tie display states to configurations, but I think that's a separate conversation. So these are two reasons why I wouldn't use configurations in some situations. Now, the first thing we need to think about when approaching configurations, and now I'm speaking specifically for the manual methods of creating configuration, is how do I create a model in such a way that it's appropriate for me to create variations? And now I'm going to keep the geometry very simple today, just so we can talk concepts and all the pieces here. But you need to be able to design your models so that they're flexible and that they can accept the potential changes. This particular example, I'm going to show you two ways that it could be designed, and one of them is flexible, one of them not so much. Also, in that process of creating the model, there's some benefits to being able to name features in such a way that it could be useful for configurations, name dimensions, and then also custom property information. This is all important. So let's just jump over to SolidWorks here for a moment. Now this particular model is what I would say is a non-flexible model. I just have, in this case in the feature tree, one single feature. However, I have a slot and a hole within this block, and what I've done by creating it in this way, and I'll just show you how this was done, is it's all done with a single sketch. I've made it so it's not as flexible if I wanted to remove the slot or if I just wanted to remove the hole. This is what I was getting at with the flexibility. Now, another approach to this, and the better approach in this case, is to build the part with each feature that you may control by basically turning on and off as separate features. In this case, this offers me a lot more flexibility to be able to do that. Now, renaming is important as well. So, we're all used to the ability to rename in the feature tree. You may want to come through here and rename a few of the features that you're going to configure later on. And I'm going to go ahead and do that on this particular part. The other thing is your dimensions, things that you're going to vary dimensionally across multiple variations. Now, we all know that we can double-click on features to bring up the dimensions for a model, but we want to name those dimensions, okay? The first thing that you're going to want to do is go to your annotations folder in the feature tree, and you want to show your feature dimensions. This brings up all the dimensions for the model. Now you'll notice as I mouse over a dimension, you get the physical name for that dimension shows up. And as I mouse over a different one, now these are very cryptic, D1, D2, and there's multiple D1s. You'll notice as I get in here, this D1 and this D1 are the same, but one belongs to the base feature, one belongs to sketch 3. Okay? So what you want to do is you want to give these names. So we can do that either in the modify dialog. You can see that there's a dimension name in here, and I can actually type it in there. Or if you just click on the dimension, you'll notice off to the left in the Property Manager under Primary Value, here we have the ability to go ahead and type in a name for a few of the dimensions. I'm going to do this for a couple of these. My length, width, and height. All right, and then I want to put my hole in here and give them names. Now, it's convenient once you do that when we get to configuring the part, but physically looking at all the features or the dimensions, I can't really see which is which. I mean, which one's the height, which one's the width. So I need to turn on those dimension names. I know I can mouse over them. You can see height, you can see width, you can see your, I guess I got these the same, but you can control these, the showing of the dimension names by going under the View menu. And this has kind of changed over the years where it's been located, but if you go under View now, you can view dimension names and turn those on. Now I can physically see anything that I've renamed, and I'm kind of ready to get started now. Those are kind of some of the preparatory things that you would use in getting going with configurations. Now let's take a look at how we manage them. And I'm going to start very basic, but we're going to get pretty intense before the end of this today. The third tab up top is our Configuration Manager. This is literally where we do a majority of the work for creating configurations. By default, every model that you have created, you have this default configuration. Now to add configurations, it's very simple. You just right-click on that top icon. You can add configuration. I'll just call this size 1, and I can subsequently add other configurations to it, like size 2. Now this is a dialog that pops up essentially that gives me some information about the variation that I'm creating. Okay, and you can see now that I have 3 variations. Now the one that's active, the one that you're viewing physically, is going to show up in the colored version of the icon. If you want to switch between configurations, one thing you can do is right click and say show configuration, which makes it now the active configuration. Okay, and that's one way to kind of switch between them. Now everything that happens here from the icon color to the checkbox actually means something, and those are some of the things that we're going to discuss today. I also want you to keep in mind that the properties that pops up when I create a new configuration is unique to that configuration, and I'm just going to quickly show you what's in one of those. If I right click on any of my variations now, I can go to the properties of that variation. You can see that it still has the name of the configuration as it was when I typed it in. I can also apply a different description in here to describe what the variation is. This is going to be my 2-inch block. Now this description, as I'm going to explain a little bit later, won't necessarily be used elsewhere. So it's more of, as you go in here, it's a description of what you've done as far as a variation of the model. But if I go in and I activate size 1 and go to the properties, you'll notice that it has its own set of properties that are unique. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So our configurations are important as far as how we manage them, but manually I'm doing everything from this configuration manager. Now let's jump back to the feature manager for a moment. Look at the top of the feature manager. When you go to the top of the feature manager on a part, it actually makes 2 callouts next to the part itself. The first one is the configuration that is active, and the second one is display states. I kind of mentioned that as our opener of how you might manage display, but the important piece is I can see the configuration from that feature tree, and you don't have to swap over to see which configuration is active. Okay, so what about deleting a configuration? Now, all of these come with the default configuration, but I can, once it's not active, I can physically delete it, okay, and remove it. Now I have my size 1 and size 2 configuration. Okay, so those are just some general information about configurations, but I want to talk more importantly about what can be configured. Now this is probably the most confusing part, and probably I would say the reason why most people are not using configurations to the extent that they could. First of all, there's a lot of things that can be configured. Some of them you'll never use. Some of them you would never even think to use. But I think more importantly, the interface and the way that configurations are created is not the same throughout the software. So whether you're configuring a dimension or you're configuring a property or a whole wizard size, they all are a little bit different in how you access and make those changes. So hopefully what I'm going to go through here now is to go through a majority of these and just show you where you would go to configure this particular item. So I'll kind of read through these as we flip back over. So the first one is we can configure feature dimensions and tolerances. Okay, so for feature dimensions, what you want to make sure is that you're on the configuration that you're going to modify. In this case, we're going to make this a 2-inch height. And when you double-click the dimension, in this dialog, I can go ahead and type in the new value. But because I've already created more than one configuration, I now have a button kind of attached to the Modify dialog. And that button is what allows me to specify which variations are going to get this change. Now I only have two variations in this case, size 1 and size 2. I can pick only the active configuration, which the thing that always confused me here is why doesn't it tell you the active configuration right here? I mean, if you look around the interface, you can find it without having to go very far, but you know, this configuration, you have to know which one you're modifying currently. If I say all, then every one of them are going to go to the 2-inch height. If I select Specify, it brings up another dialog that shows me the two configurations, and you can see only the second one has a description, and it allows me to control select the ones I want to make the change on. Okay, so you have choices, different ways of applying this dimensional change. In this case, I'm going to make the change just for the one configuration. Now, you'll notice that some things have changed if I look back to the configuration manager for a moment. Notice the size 2 is active. I have a checkbox listed next to the size 2, but size 1 is inactive, and it has a minus sign next to it. The minus sign is an indication that it does not and has not loaded all the information to rebuild that configuration. Okay, now here's one thing to think about with configurations. It's not separate parts that it has to load in like an assembly, but there's other pieces of information that unless it has it loaded, it doesn't know how to build that variation. And the check mark lets you know whether it has all the information loaded in memory to quickly build that configuration. So if I go and I activate or show configuration 1, you can see that it now has a check mark next to it. And let's say I had 20 or 30 different sizes here. What this does for me realistically is I can easily and quickly flop between configurations, and it loads them very, very quickly because all the information for both of those sizes is loaded into memory currently. So changing dimensions and modifying the configuration for the dimension is done through the Modify dialog, but I'm going to show you other methods in a little bit. So how do I suppress features, equations, and end conditions? So again, one of the things I was mentioning is that everything's done a little in different ways depending on what you're trying to configure. Now the term suppress may be new for some of you. Suppress is just temporarily removing the feature from the model. It keeps it in the tree, but it removes the math behind it. Now suppressing features can be done several different ways. I can select a feature and I get the pop-up to suppress it. I can select the feature, I can go to edit, and I can get suppress with options of this configuration, all configurations, or specified. So I have several different ways of going about doing that. And in size 1, let's say we don't have the slot, I can go ahead and suppress the slot in size 1. Now if I go back, I can see that I have size 2 with the slot and size 1 without the slot. But what about other things like equations? Now I'm just going to create a quick one here. Let's say I had an equation that said the height is equal to, okay, let's see, the width. Now, as soon as I have more than one variation, I can now control also, using a very similar method, I can control whether the equation is active for this configuration or not. So what I'm trying to get at here is that every feature that I'm going through has a different way of manually configuring what you're working with. If I edit this feature here, okay, now one of the things you can configure is an end condition. What if I no longer wanted it to be a through-all hole? I wanted it to be blind, and we're going to go 1/10 of an inch, but only for this configuration. See, this is a different method than what we've just been showing for equations for controlling configurations. I guess my only recommendation is that you look at the dialogues that you're presented as you're creating the features, and in there you're most likely going to find a lot of these configure options. And you can see now I have my size 2 with the through-all hole and my size 1 that has the different depth or different end condition. Other things that we can configure, mass and center of mass. So if I go to the Evaluate tab and go to the mass properties, we have the option to specify a mass on this particular part. Now, in order to do that, I've got to override the density values that are already supplied with the material, but you have an option here to override both the mass and center of mass values. But notice as I get to the bottom of that dialog, here's the ability to set the mass of the block or the center of mass for different configurations. Okay, so that can be configured as well. How about sketch planes? Sketch relations can also be configured. So for instance, I want to change the plane in which this hole is on. We're all familiar with the idea that you can change the surface or the plane that was used. But notice now that I have multiple variations, I can modify which configuration has which plane being used. How about sketch relations? If I go in and edit the sketch, and we go to Display Delete Relations, you'll notice now I can suppress sketch relations and tie it to a variation of the design. Okay? And so I think you're getting the sense of how confusing this could be if you don't know where to look to vary these different things. A couple other things I want to point out, actually 3 more. When it comes to material, okay, it's a little different. Again, I can select a material, and in the material dialog you're going to see a button titled Config. And again, we have this very similar dialog that allows me to specify, okay, only this configuration gets this material. Okay. And you'll notice now that as we flip through, one of them should have, not sure why, but that's how you would assign a particular material to a particular configuration. Now, most of us are used to using custom properties as well. And sometimes you have other property information to describe, size 1 and size 2 beyond the properties listed in the configuration dialog here. So what if we had like finish, heat treat information, other information to describe it? If I go to File Properties, there's a configuration specific tab in File Properties. So if I wanted to put in something like finish or stock size, I could go ahead and let's see here. Stock. I can put in some information about that particular size by making the selection right here. Okay, so this property is only for this configuration. Now, most of us are used to using this tab in our custom properties. The problem with this tab is these properties are to the entire file, not to the individual variations, which I'm talking about at this point. Okay. Now, next thing we want to talk about is hole wizard holes. You can configure the size of a hole wizard hole. So let's place one on here just so I can show this. If I place a hole wizard hole in the side of the model here, let's do a, let's see, number 8. Go ahead and place this on the side here. Now, once I have the hole wizard hole in there and I edit the feature of the hole wizard hole, you'll notice under the size section where you physically pick the size of the hole that you're creating, that there's going to be also a configurations option in here. So now I can change the hole sizes. Instead of having separate features, I can just modify the feature using configurations and change the hole size. So let's say for this configuration, let's cancel this. Let's go to a number 3, and we'll say just for this configuration. Okay, so now if we look at this, we have this configuration with the smaller one, and I can choose, let's see here, let me unsuppress this one here, and for this configuration, let's make this the number 8 for this configuration. So now we should have 2 separate hole wizard sizes in 2 variations of the design. I hope this is coming across pretty well in the webinar here. So, moral of the story with parts is there's a lot that you can configure, but there's a lot of different places to go to configure the information. Now, I want to take you back through the properties window for the configuration properties and get in a little more detail now that we've described some of the things that we can configure. I mentioned that we can put a description in here. Now, this description doesn't end up in the configuration specific custom properties. However, if you select use in bill of materials, that will actually override any description that's typed in the configuration specific properties. So this can be the overriding description. So if I wanted this on the BOM, I could do that. Notice also there is a button in here to the custom properties that takes you directly to the configuration specific properties for the size that you're working on. So I can continue to add information in here. Now, working my way down a little bit here, the next one is really dealing with part number. And I notice already that I've gotten a question about these variations internally in a lot of organizations have different part numbers, which is absolutely fine. But how do we control that? And we control that through this option here. So we tell the software, what is the part number when this is used in the bill of materials? Well, by default, all of the property configuration property windows say that you're using the document name, which in this case is just start.sldprt. And no matter which configuration I use, it's just using the same part number. Well, what if I wanted to use the configuration name? In this case, size 2, and that name could be a different part number. Or the third option is I actually specify a part number. I can type in that part number specifically into this dialog. And I'll show you that it's different than the size 1. You can see size 1 is still listed as document name. I could say user specified name here, and I can give a different part number for this one as well. Now notice that once I've applied the part number value, that it actually lists it next to the name of the configuration, which makes it real nice so you can see that information directly in the tree as you're looking at the configuration. So that's a great way of varying the part number for your bill of material work. Now let's go back into properties again for a moment here. Couple other things at the bottom. If you wanted to use various colors for certain configurations, you can use configuration specific color and apply a specific color to only this variation. I'm going to talk about rebuild and save marks, so I won't mention that right now. But suppress features, what this means is if I happen to add a hole to another variation, do you want it automatically removed from size 2? And right now it's set to automatically suppress features. Well, let's test out what that really means. If I go to size 1 and I create a new hole, I'm just going to create a little cut, a through-all cut. You can see that this feature exists in size 1, but if I go to size 2, it doesn't. It automatically is removed from size 2. And this is because of this option in the properties that says, hey, if you add features to other variations, I want them automatically suppressed on this one. Now, I would keep that on just simply because you don't want it to automatically add the feature to everything that you've created. This gives you kind of a different control over it. Okay? So a little bit more about the configuration manager, but I want to kind of step aside and start to talk a little bit about the assembly side of things. Okay, so with assemblies, we have a lot of the same control. We can control whether something is suppressed, and unfortunately SolidWorks, the opposite of suppressed is resolved in assemblies. It's not suppress and unsuppress. But if I right click on a component, I do have the same dialog that you saw in the feature tree for features to suppress it. I can change the configuration being used as well. If I go to assemblies, this particular fork has multiple variations inside its part file. And notice I can go ahead and make changes and pick which variation. But now notice also next to it, if I'm going to change this to a 2.5-inch fork, I can now choose which configurations of the assembly are getting the 2.5 version. Now let me go to the configuration manager in the assembly, and you'll notice that the 2.5-R-BP is active. I have the check mark noting that it's loaded all the information, but the rest of them are in the minus sign. If I double click on any of them, you can see that now that it's loaded the data for the 2.5 EPT, and I can activate and load any of these configurations or all of these configurations depending on what I need. So that's what this means. When I'm changing the part that's being used, which variations of the assembly am I also changing? Now, I mentioned the display piece as well. The display states here are actually linked to configurations. I think we're going to have a lunch and learn on display states, but just keep in mind, think of it as a way of changing transparency, hide, or show that is tied to a specific variation. So with this variation, I may want to just make this one transparent, or I may want to show it in hidden removed. I do that with the display states, and it's actually tied to configurations here. Now I can also, if I go to a mate in an assembly and I edit the feature on that mate, okay, I can actually configure whether or not this mate is suppressed or unsuppressed in particular configurations. Okay. If there's dimensions related to a mate, I can configure those. We also in assemblies have the center of mass. I can't suppress and unsuppress features of individual components here, but what I can do is if there's assembly features like planes or cutaways or those types of things, I can suppress or unsuppress those or the dimensions of those. The same thing works in assemblies for properties. I have configuration specific properties. And look at this one. I have a bunch of information that describes this 3.5 RSS. If I change to a different configuration, you can see that the property information does change as well. Now another thing that you may not think about, which I think is useful, is you can actually configure which component is fixed and which components are floating. So if I go and I activate a configuration, I can now choose to float this particular component. And as soon as I go there, it says all configuration, this configuration, or specify. But again, the conversation we've been having about all the different ways that the dialog presents itself is kind of the same in assembly. It's all depending on what you're trying to configure. Okay. So let's go back to our presentation for a moment here. So assemblies, we've kind of went through a lot of these and what we're able to do. Now how do we go to that next step? Because we've talked about the confusion involved somewhat in what can be configured, how do you get to it, but what has SolidWorks done to make it easier? And I saw that only 20% are using this functionality, so this may be something new for you. There's a tool inside of configurations in parts and assemblies called the Modify dialog. And the Modify dialog is there to help you configure 4 main pieces, which is your dimensions, your features, your component suppression states, and your materials. Now, I wish they would complete this feature, but for the most part, this is the main reason why people use configurations, is really to vary these 4 or 5 things. Now, it supports features, sketches, dimensions, and materials in parts. And in assemblies, it supports components being turned on and off, assembly features being turned on and off with the dimensions, mates being turned on and off. So let me show you a little bit about this dialog and how you get to it. And I'm sure that most of you have seen it. I'm just not sure, if you understood or saw how to use it. So we're going to go back to our original part here. I'm going to hide my feature dimensions, and we can start working here. Now, if you've ever right-clicked on a feature, for instance, this cut extrude, and you found an option on your right-click titled Configure Feature, if I select that, what's neat is it brings up this dialog that shows us which configurations we currently have and how that particular feature might vary between the 2 configurations. You can see that in size 1, it's unsuppressed. In size 2, it's suppressed. So I can clearly see how that varies. Okay? Now, if I say OK to this dialog, it doesn't go anywhere. There's no other place to find that information. However, if I right-click and go back to Configure Feature, there's some neat things that we can do in here. First of all, I can create new configurations right from this dialog. I can make size 3, and in size 3 I can have that suppressed or unsuppressed. Okay. Now, I don't want to just view the cut extrude. Maybe I want to see which configurations have the hole wizard hole also suppressed or unsuppressed. So just going over the feature tree, I can double click on the counter bore, and it actually shows me which configurations are suppressed and unsuppressed for that counter bore. And now I can choose, you know what, I don't want the counter bore in these two. So again, now I'm starting to build this table-like structure. Now what about dimensions? If I go to the graphics area, remember our length, width, height, and hole size? I can now come in here and start to select some of the dimensions that we have in that particular model, and you'll notice that will also start to populate the table here. Now here's where I usually make my mistake. You can actually go in here and now start controlling these values right from this table. Now to me, this makes it a lot easier to view what you're doing. The problem with modified configurations is you can't have all those other things that we talked about in this table structure. So things like equations can't be in here. However, material can. So if I go over here to material, you can see, I'll stretch this out a little further. I can now go right into and select the material, even browse into my material database. This one's brass, this one's brass, and this one's nickel. Okay, and I can control these. Now here's the word of caution with this, because I think you're going to try to use this, because I think it's great. If I just say apply and OK to this, this table goes away, and I have to recreate it next time I want to view it just like this. Unless I come over here and I actually give this a name. I'll call this configs. Now once I give it a name, I have an option to save the table view. Okay. Now any changes that I've made here, I can apply, I can say OK, and the table has been saved. Now where is it saved? This is important to understand that. If I go over to the configuration manager, we now have a tables folder, and now that table view is there, and I can right click on it and say show table, and it brings me right back to it. Now I can get to the same table structure, create size 4 if I wanted to, and continue to build new variations of my design with different sizes right in here. Okay, so it's a great way of using a table structure to modify configurations. Now I can create multiple tables as well. So if I wanted a different table showing me, let's go to my size 2 here, showing me the variations on the slot size. If I right click a dimension, I can go to configure dimension again, and I can make a completely different table for the slots. Let's control the variations of the slots here. I might call that table slot configure and save that table out as well. Okay. Now you'll notice that I have multiple tables here, multiple ways of working with configurations. All right. So a couple other things I just want to show you in this dialog before we move on. Just keep in mind that you can configure, there's limited things that you can configure using modify, but dimensions, feature state, material, sketches, you can all control all those things using this dialog. Otherwise, you got to use the manual methods that we just went through. A couple other things in here that will be useful to you. There is a button in here that says, you know what, bring me all parameters that are configured between in the model itself. And this will actually look in the model and see if there's any other items that are being varied between the different sizes. Notice it didn't bring up the slot because I didn't change the dimensions, but if I did, it would actually automatically bring those parameters in here. Another thing that you're able to do is actually hide or show any custom properties that have been configured as well. So this will manage those. And I could go ahead and add custom properties like company name, or once I specify those, the dialog, I'm sorry, popped out. The dialog adds them to the window. Okay? So now I can go ahead and configure custom properties in here as well. So the modify dialog, I think, is a much more useful way of configuring, as long as you're not hindered by the idea of only being able to configure using modify features, sketches, dimensions, material. For assembly, it's components, assembly features, mates, and assembly feature dimensions. Okay. Now I've also want to talk a little bit about some miscellaneous configuration tools that you need to be aware of, and I've already got some questions on a couple of these here. I want to start out with special assembly configurations. Okay, so let's go back to SolidWorks for a moment. I'm just going to close this and we'll go ahead and save it. If I go to File, Open, and I find maybe my assembly that I'm working with here, in the Open dialog, there is the option to open to a specific configuration, and that's fine. With that specific configuration, I can open directly and make that configuration active. But at the bottom of the configuration dialog, there's a couple of special ways of getting configurations. You have to set it to advanced and then select open, which is going to prompt you and open this new dialog that you may not have seen before. There's two that I want to point out that are useful, or fairly useful for us. First of all, if I want to open this document with a new configuration, so it's actually going to create a new configuration, and it's going to turn on and show all models in the assembly. So think about when you have multiple variations and things are turned on and off by suppression. I just want to open this assembly and unsuppress everything all in one shot. Well, I can give this a configuration name, maybe call it test. And when I say OK, it's going to open everything up and everything in the tree will be unsuppressed. Now, on that same sense, if I do the same file open here and select my caster, there is one in here called open and show me only the assembly structure. So you can physically open the model, create a configuration where all the components are suppressed, but the feature tree is intact, so you can see what that feature tree looked like. Okay, so it's a great way if you have an upper level assembly, you just want to open it up, maybe look at all the structure of the assembly. Those are a couple special ways of kind of dealing with configurations. Okay. Now let's go to my part here for a moment, because the next thing I want to talk about is something called derived configurations. Derived configuration creates a parent-child relationship between one configuration and another. If you change it in the parent, and this goes throughout SolidWorks, right? If we change the parent, it changes in the child. So how do we create this parent-child relationship in configurations, and why? So I'm going to go back to size 1 here for a moment. Let's say I had multiple variations of size 1 where the only thing that changed was the hole diameter. Well, what I can do, if I right-click on the configuration, I can add a child to size 1. I'm going to call this hole big, whatever the name has to be. Okay. Now what happens here is you now get this sub-menu to size 1, and all this means is now I can go in and I can vary this hole for just this configuration. Let's say I wanted to make it an 1/8 inch. Okay. All the rest of the parameters are controlled based upon the parent. So you know how we've been having that when we change a dimension, we have to specify which configurations it's going to change in? Well, you don't need to do that when you have a derived configuration, because now in a derived configuration, I could change things like the width, okay, and I could change it for this configuration. Let's change it to 1.125. And because the child is tied to it, you'll notice the child is still 1.125. I didn't have to say change this one and this one. So derived configurations takes all the parameters from its parent unless you override them, which in this case I made a smaller hole. It's a great way of just organizing, making your life a little easier as far as changing features and changing dimensions. And you can, in that modify box that we were talking about here, you can create derived configurations in here as well. So I want you to be aware of that. Okay. I've showed you the open to configuration. Two last things, and we're running out of time here. Save and rebuild mark. When SolidWorks goes to close the file, it unloads all the information, right? So next time you open this part up, you've got to switch configuration. It's got to reload that information. Unless you add what we call a rebuild or a save mark. A rebuild and save mark is done through a right-click option inside the configuration manager. And what that says is that each time you save, it's going to rebuild and store that information, so next time it opens up, this is active and ready for you. So I can turn on this rebuild and save mark. Now when I save the document, it's there for me. Now that's also located, and I wanted to show you this, in the properties, add rebuild and save mark in the advanced option. So you can have that automatically set in the system. So that way, and you'll find if you start using configurations, especially at upper level assemblies, loading them could take a little bit of time, and with this it stores and loads them on the initial load, and will make that a little bit easier for you. Now the last thing I wanted to show before we answer any questions here is something called the configuration publisher. Now I'm not going to go into too many details, I just want to let you know that this exists. Now the configuration publisher takes configurations to the next level. It does require a design table, which I'm going to show here in a minute, but it's a way of creating an interface so that you can create configurations on the fly. Now think of a part that you have multiple variations of, where there might be 1,000 or 2,000 variations. You're not going to want to put every variation in the part file. The part's going to get huge, and loading that data is going to take a while. But what if you can create an interface that would allow the user to create the configuration on the fly? So I want to show you an example of this. I'm going to use the same caster we've been using. To create a configuration publisher, it's just a right click at the top of the configuration manager. Now this one's already built, so I'm going to edit the feature on this. And it uses a design table, which is a whole nother conversation, but this is what the publisher is. You basically create an interface that gives questions or gives a dialogue for the person to select information about the size that you're going to use. Now where this comes into play is if I'm trying to add this to an assembly. So let me close this down. We'll create a new assembly here. And I want to insert this component. Browse to it here. All right. And I go to place it in the assembly. Now notice what comes up, configure component. This is that dialogue that you create. Now this allows you to say, you know what, I need the 2.5 one of these, I need the rubber wheels, and it creates this, it tells you which configuration in this case that it's going to select. Or I can just pick from the configuration name, which are the lists of what we had, and add it in that way. So I just wanted to show that Configuration Publisher is kind of a great way of automating this a little further, and I think we'll have a lunch and learn going through that and design tables. So that's what I had for today. Thanks for attending. I'm going to maybe go through some